Greetings, friends of liberty. 'Twas so long today with my tailor. Finishing the last touches on my waistcoat, I can hardly make it to library before dinner. So then, without further ado, allow me to transition to my North American accent for the greater ease of comprehension of those Americans amongst us. We are assembled here today for the fourth and final video on the cause of political correctness, in which video I shall touch first on various additional coercive factors and then finally tie a bow around it all. Additional coercive factors. The first additional coercive factor is related to the Civil Rights Act and is simply the huge size of the Department of Justice and other federal bureaucracies. To paraphrase one employer, technically, I could bring suit against the EEOC, but not really. A little company like mine, compared to the enormous Department of Justice with its inexhaustible reserve of federal funds, has no actual chance to win in most cases. And even if I did win, I'd be insolvent anyway. Additional coercive factor number 2. Threats of Title 7 and 9 liability imposed for the slightest offense are one of the greatest tripwires for the present manifestations of political correctness throughout society. Businesses, state and federal departments, and colleges react in many cases not because they're necessarily intolerant of free speech, but because they've been advised by counsel that the respective bureaucracies or courts may apply extremely strict liability standards during any investigation or prosecution. To paraphrase legal analyst and First Amendment scholar Kingsley Brown, if the Civil Rights Act applied purely to speech that offends, there would nonetheless be a chilling effect. But the additional problem is that the liability the companies face for controlling the speech of those in their employ is very high, and the criterion of what speech is allowable is very vague. That means the companies definitely will err on the side of caution in policing what their employees say and do. So for this reason, if the tyrannical titles 7 and 9 and any amendment or regulation with a similar effect and interpretation were repealed tomorrow, this in and of itself, without any ideological or philosophical change of heart for anyone in the U.S., would immediately bring, within a short period of time, a significant behavioral reduction in the amount of political correctness enforced and manifested by many institutions. They would simply no longer need to be concerned about this large, potentially institution-threatening liability triggered by virtually any innocuous remark. Derivative causes. Not included among the 3 primary factors listed here, nonprofit status, huge amounts of federal funding, and racist and sexist civil rights legislation with its persecutory bureaucracies driving the descent into PC conformity, has been the institutions of tenure and governmental accreditation. While these 2 factors are also part of the problem, they appear to exist only because of the other 3 more primary factors already mentioned. However, let's examine these derivative factors briefly. Tenure. Although the percentage of tenured faculty is on the decline, having decreased from 75 to 27% from 1960 to 2013, tenure exists likely mainly because of the nonprofit and thus implicitly subsidized nature of higher education, being essentially a kickback that the professorial class has extracted from institutions participating just as K-12 teachers unions receive. How do we know this? For at least 2 reasons. First, examples like Lindenwood University and Olin College of Engineering, with their respective merit pay and contract employment, where professors are nonetheless happy to work without tenure, provide typical free market alternatives in which tenure doesn't generally exist, since it makes as little sense for a college to commit itself to a professor for life as it would to commit to marriage with no possibility of divorce, as Catholics used to. Second, although tenure, as is overwhelmingly believed, is held to be needed to protect academic freedom, the reality is that in a free society it would be well protected, just as freedom of expression is now protected in the newspaper business. The values of reporters and columnists naturally align with the newspapers that share their political and journalistic values, just as the editorial and journalistic values of newspapers now impel them to give deserving contracts based on journalistic productivity. Such natural mutuality would exist in higher education, as it overwhelmingly did before the institution of tenure emerged in American education in the increasingly progressive 20th century. The effects of tenure, by forcing colleges to keep professors for life, and by the fact that they only need a majority to make decisions, give the faculty a quasi-monopolistic power over the direction of the entire university itself, which is why tenured professors have been unfavorably compared to terrorists, since at least one can negotiate with a terrorist. To see the harm that this imbalance of power brings, imagine that in the IT sector, instead of Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, or Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett controlling the direction of Apple, Microsoft, and Hewlett-Packard, the employees had done so instead. Would Apple, Microsoft, and Hewlett-Packard have become as unique, effective, and innovative as they became? In addition, those majoritarian voting procedures help increase the number of Democratic faculty, contributing to driving the present leftist imbalance. As Dean Herbert London remarked, and again I paraphrase, "It became noticeable that although I picked out candidates for tenure regardless of political affiliation, it was, surely only by coincidence, noticeable that only candidates on the left were the first ones chosen for tenure." Then, of course, these very same newly tenured professors repeated the process. And all this occurred even though political affiliation was never explicitly admitted as a criterion. So as a result of these factors, higher education, again in contrast to what existed in the 19th century, is now so dominated by liberal ideas in many departments that if a university president makes one stray remark contravening the PC orthodoxy, as Harvard's unfortunate president Larry Summers discovered back in 2005, he's gone. Here the Harvard faculty were goaded on by feminists, made hysterical upon hearing their male president articulate the thesis of innate sex differences. And just as it becomes easier to throw their weight around in canceling presidents, so too the faculty make it harder, as in K-12, to fire their colleagues, in one case taking 46 days of consultations and meetings before sanctioning an individual's release. Number 2, accreditation agencies. With the GI Bill in 1952 and Higher Education Act in 1965, accreditation of colleges was deemed necessary for them to receive the ever-increasing stream of federal funds dispersed. However, the problematical cases of George Mason, Temple, Thomas Aquinas, Patrick Henry, and Baruch colleges, as well as numerous others, demonstrated that the respective regional accreditation agencies have sometimes tried to cram their own reverse racism and sexism down collegiate throats. Paraphrasing Sander and Taylor from their book Mismatch, when referring to the case of George Mason University's law school's experience with the ABA accrediting agency. What happens to a school that attempts to implement a rational form of affirmative action with outreach to the minority community, but which at the same time doesn't fudge on standards, as so many other institutions have? What happens is that the American Bar Association attempts to intimidate them by warning of a denial of accreditation, a denial, of course, which would mean its destruction, and if it persists in such a rational approach. Clearly, what the accrediting body desires is that every institution follow its guidance on and degree of recommended affirmative action. And if an institution like George Mason Law implements its own highly successful program that doesn't involve fudging on the standards, the very success of that alternative program poses a dangerous threat to the ABA's whole accreditation scheme. The ABA and others have subsequently decided to take a subtler approach by implicitly threatening sanctions and conformity to the vague ideal of diversity. As with the Office of Civil Rights, the ABA understood that in vagueness lies their strength. However, without the two legal threats mentioned previously, of threatening to deny colleges the ability to accept federal funding, and of the Civil Rights Act and subsequent legislation compelling racist or sexist treatment, these accreditation agencies could and would be largely ignored by colleges and universities. Why? Because the individual reputational worth of their degrees would prove more valuable. For example, would Harvard before World War II have really cared whether it received accreditation by the New England Commission of Higher Education? No. Thus, the coercive nature of these agencies in the causal mix is largely derivative. Accreditation agencies can and do also block the emergence of newer types of disruptive educational institutions, especially for-profit and those utilizing vast amounts of massive open online courses, many of which could offer more value depending on the student and be less politically correct. In this way, even though derivative, like the disparate impact standard, which now oppresses the land, accreditation agencies grant even more monopoly power to the increasingly dysfunctional established colleges. Note finally that Hillsdale and Grove City College are well-known rare exceptions by their practice of rejecting all federal aid and funding scholarships and financial aid privately, in freeing themselves from the necessity of treating their students and faculty in a racist and sexist manner. Hillsdale has a long tradition of moral integrity, having declined to participate in the Tangerine Bowl in 1957, for example, because of its attempt to prevent minority students from accompanying the team. And Grove City is also notable for its relationships with numerous libertarian and free market scholars and thinkers, no warmed-up German historical or progressive ideas praising the greatness of the Prussian state or New Deal or Great Society regimes for them. So now, dear listeners, we arrive at our conclusion. How does civilization progress? By two primary factors: an increase in knowledge and an increase in the protection of property rights. This is its sum total. In addition, as a corollary, both factors mutually reinforce each other in either direction, so that if one goes down, the other does. And if one goes up, the other does as well. So as a classical example, once the ability of the Roman Empire to protect its population from internal violence, like increasing inflation and serfdom, and external violence, like barbarian invasions, decreased enough, the Roman Empire fell and lost its knowledge. And the Dark Ages, an era of relative ignorance and civilizational decline, descended. Here in the United States, over the last century plus, the causal chain leading to political correctness has been a gradual ratcheting effect of both increasing educational rights violations and increasing relative educational and societal ignorance, just like with the Roman Empire, one reinforcing the other. The first cause, as argued, were the laws privileging both private and public nonprofit colleges, which then slowly, from the late 19th century onwards, led to a relative intellectual decline from the excellence we might have achieved in the humanities in American higher education. For example, in just one area, numerous prominent American economists, leading members of whom formed the American Economics Association, were taught or influenced by the German historical school, thus having brought some of their coercive ideas developed in German state-controlled universities into American academic and intellectual life. The resulting relative ignorance in this and other areas of higher education brought into our university system a relative shift to statist ideas, consistently expressed and implemented in the extensive progressive legislation of the 20th century. This shift, in direct opposition to the wisdom of the Enlightenment generation and the Founding Fathers and their more astute, classically liberal descendants, led subsequent academics and intellectuals to imagine that the second and third instances of rights violations, huge amounts of federal aid only granted upon conformity to racist and sexist legislation and mandates, could ever be beneficial. So to reiterate, these three successive primary coercive forces that I've outlined over time in the 20th century have created, with the corresponding losses of knowledge in the humanities, a perfect storm of harm to further degrade society and higher education as well, with the worsening indoctrination of students over the last half-century. The result has been an increasing national hysteria of reverse racism, sexism, the end is nigh environmentalism, a growing cult of gender misperception, and other irrational niche ideologies increasingly filling our society with fools. These fools, once they drive back home from their graduation ceremonies, as they have now especially for over a half-century, become employed by and inhabit our varied societal institutions, creating a worsening crisis of relative civilizational and institutional decline in all areas of human endeavor: governmental, scientific, educational, economic, artistic, and philanthropic. We are seeing thus a deterioration of the productivity of all America, driven by the increasing relative inferiority from what might have been of the educational system. Also significant as a follow-on effect, as mentioned, is the direct legal intimidation exerted on institutions by the prospect of being out of compliance with the racist and sexist standards imposed by the civil rights bureaucracies. In a nutshell then, here in America, we are running a vast social studies experiment now for more than a century to determine whether, by slowly poisoning the educational system of a country, we can destroy that country. I would suggest we stop that experiment. On that note, I bid you well and remain, as ever, the Scarlet Pimpernel.